Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, NSF456-Vaccine Storage, a new standard detailing requirements for vaccine cold storage. I am Marie Stone of LabRoots, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. Today's educational web seminar is presented by LabRoots and brought to you by Thermo Scientific. To learn more, visit thermofisher.com. We encourage you to participate today by submitting any questions you may have during the presentation. To do so, simply type them into the Ask a Question box and click Send. We'll answer as many questions as we have time for at the end of the presentation. You may also submit any technical issues here as well if you have trouble seeing or hearing the presentation. In addition to submitting questions for our speaker, we encourage you to participate in 2 poll questions before we start the presentation. In order to submit your answer, click on your selection when it is displayed on your screen. Our first poll question is, will your facility require NSF 456 units be purchased for future vaccine storage? Yes, no, unsure. Again, to make your selection, click on the answer. The question again, will your facility require NSF 456 units be purchased for future vaccine storage? We'll leave this up here for a few more seconds, give you time to make your selection. And then our second poll question is, before this webinar, had you heard of NSF ANSI 456? Yes, no, unsure. Again, in order to make your selection, click on your answer. Before this webinar, had you heard of NSF ANSI 456? Yes, no, unsure. We'll give you a few more seconds to record your answer. Thank you for your participation. I'd like to now welcome our speaker, Chase Heibel, Senior Global Product Manager, Laboratory Refrigeration and Sample Transport, Thermo Scientific. Chase, you may now begin your presentation.
Thank you. And thank you for having me, and thank you to everyone attending. I know these are crazy times for anyone related to scientific and healthcare applications, or rather, really anyone in general. But so I really appreciate you taking this time out of your day. During this discussion, we'll dive into a new standard that was released last year that impacts the storage of vaccines. Very timely release considering everything that is going on. And while the standard is focused on vaccine storage, the learnings and recommendations presented really translate to a broad array of scientific and clinical cold chains. To summarize what we'll be going through today, we'll start off with the new era of vaccines we're going through, what the current recommendations are for vaccine storage within the U.S., the standards that have now been released, and we'll go into detail on those, and then what solutions we provide and other considerations you should take when working with cold storage units. So first, let's jump in, starting with a new era of vaccines, and more to the point, the importance of a robust cold chain. Vaccines as we knew them have fundamentally changed in the last 2 years, and their importance, while always being high, have become more pronounced in the public psyche. Access to and availability of mRNA vaccines was not available less than 2 years ago. None have been commercially available or launched. Now there's a large pipeline of new mRNA-based vaccines and therapies making their way to the market. This change in vaccine technology also drove a change in how they are produced, stored, and managed throughout the cold chain. The new biology also drove new temperature profiles for cold chain. While an Ebola vaccine used -70 Celsius in the last decade, focus in this ultra cold space was never broadly given nor commonly used. For that matter, before these COVID vaccines, even a -20 Celsius storage temperature was not mainstream, as only a few vaccines on the market today require it. There has been a lot of work this last year and a half by manufacturers to supply these cold chains with the proper equipment to transform and expand the cold chain. But that statement in and of itself implies there was proper equipment for these cold chains, and more specifically at the end site storage locations. Proper equipment standards that helped ensure the units could store those vaccines at the right temperatures to ensure efficacy. They didn't exist. When there's a breakdown in that cold chain and temperatures exceed the bounds prescribed by the manufacturer, that is when vaccine wastage occurs. Even with all the scrutiny today around COVID vaccine, wastage still occurs. The CDC requires all organizations that administer the vaccines to report the number of vaccine doses that were quote unquote unused, spoiled, expired, or wasted as required by the relevant jurisdiction. The CDC also asks states to describe their wastage monitoring method during the distribution planning process. Vaccine providers, such as pharmacies and hospitals, are supposed to provide data on wasted doses to their state health agencies, which then send the information to the CDC. Like many parts of the initial vaccine rollout, that didn't go as perfectly as to plan as it could have. And that isn't a criticism to the agency or companies at all. What has been accomplished over the last year and a half by all those involved has been nothing short of miraculous. State by state, reporting requirements vary and are not reliably communicated to vaccine providers. Even when the rules are clear, they are not regularly enforced, nor the numbers reported to the public. Early in the rollout within the US, the CDC recorded about 200,000 wasted dosage 3 months into the country's effort to vaccinate the masses. Of those, one retail pharmacy chain was responsible for nearly half, while another 21%. And we must remember, at the time, vaccines were hard to come by, and every single one of them was needed. The likely overall number is much higher. This is since while there's a requirement for reporting, there isn't a penalty, or wasn't at the time, for not reporting. Putting this into a global context for all vaccines, based on an early study conducted by the World Health Organization, or the WHO, it is estimated that approximately 50% of all vaccines are wasted yearly. That is an extraordinarily high number that, if applied to the early COVID rollout, would have been detrimental, especially as some of the more developing countries are even today struggling to get any meaningful supply. Now, there's a lot of reasons for that wastage. Expired vaccines is a big part of it, but another part of it is, and a leading cause of the wastage, is improper storage during the vaccine cold chain. Exposure to temperatures outside of those prescribed by the drug manufacturers' guidelines causes vaccines to lose efficacy, and they therefore must be disposed of. Something to keep in mind when talking about vaccine wastage is it isn't just a financial impact, but also a public health impact. The longer it takes to vaccinate the populace and to achieve herd or higher immunity levels, the higher the rate of infection, hospitalization, and death will stay. And that's for any endemic pandemic, regardless if it's COVID. One of other factor that is hugely important, especially with these vaccines, is that with wastage or ineffective dosage being given, the more negatively impacted public confidence becomes. Justified or not, there's a tremendous amount of distrust, skepticism, or wait and see approach being taken regarding these vaccines, and any breakdown in the process related to them can fuel that more. For these reasons, making sure vaccine cold chain is as strong as possible is crucially important. So we talked about wastage and the CDC's requirements for reporting it, at least, versus via the emergency use authorization for COVID. But now let's review the current recommendations for vaccines in the US and see how they mitigate against some of this wastage. So currently, the US CDC only provides recommendations for the handling and storage of vaccines, not standards, not regulations, but recommendations. Now, there's some requirements for participation in programs like the Vaccines for Children program, but even those don't look at the equipment themselves in any meaningful way. These recommendations are compiled into a single document that is updated and published yearly and is called the Vaccine Storage and Handling Toolkit. It reflects best practices for vaccine storage and handling, and the 2021 toolkit is designed to help healthcare providers find information they need quickly and easily. The beginning chapters address the three main elements of an effective cold chain: a well-trained staff, reliable storage and temperature monitoring equipment, and accurate vaccine inventory management. It does not, however, go into detail on what an appropriate vaccine refrigerator and freezers are. The only real criteria is that it not be a dormitory style or bar style combo unit. It's a pretty low bar. From a temperature storage recommendation, the CDC does provide two ranges: frozen, which is -15 to -50 Celsius, and refrigerated, which is 2 to 8 Celsius. But given no guidelines on how that value is to be determined other than to have a single digital data logger with the features listed on the screen. Independent probe, detachable, it can be calibrated, low battery indicator, just very rudimentary recommendations. Overall, though, there was no standard today in the US or then in the US for what a vaccine cold storage should be. And when I say that what a unit should be, I mean, how is the unit designed? What's the unit's performance? What supporting documentation does it have to support the application of storing vaccines? And we'll go into more and more detail when we talk about the standard itself on each of those points. If we put this into the lens of today's COVID vaccines, we must consider what is written in the emergency use authorizations and the playbooks provided by the CDC and the drug manufacturers themselves. The EUA, or Emergency Use Authorizations, and CDC playbook guidelines, for example, for the Moderna vaccine, only provide a temperature range and duration for them at each temperature, i.e., -20 storage for X amount of days or months or weeks, 2 to 8 for X amount of days, and room temperature for X amount of hours. But they don't give you how that is to be determined, those ranges, or how they should be monitored. So we have to rely upon what's written in the toolkit. Um, and as we saw, that was just a single probe located in the cabinet that's giving a generalized indication of what the temperature is within the refrigerator or freezer. That leaves a tremendous room for how the refrigerator and freezer is actually performing, because not all places within a refrigerator or freezer are the same temperature. It also, again, leaves a huge room for interpretation of, can I use single door, double door? Does it need to have a display? No display? Alarms of any kind? Does it have to have access ports to run those data probes through? Could it be auto or manual defrost? Is there a time that's allowed outside of those temperature ranges to accommodate door openings or defrost? Recommended performance, et cetera, et cetera. And why is this important? And why may this be a problem? If you remember that most basic recommendations of a single data logger with a weighted probe placed in the cabinet, doesn't specify where, with a specific uncertainty degree, and reading, which I didn't mention, at a wide reading interval of maybe as little as once every 30 minutes, on the screen you will see an example of a temperature map of a basic commercial grade, basic lab grade refrigerator. Most of us would assume a refrigerator is a refrigerator and should hold product well above freezing and below a reasonably warm temperature. That is not the case at all. Not all refrigerators and freezers are created equal. Some are designed to store food, which can be much warmer or with a wider range, or industrial applications, medical applications. Some are for chromatography applications. There are many different shapes, sizes, flavors of units in the market, and as a result, they have different temperature performances within them. And not all units can meet a 2 to 8 or -15 to -50 performance. But what is that performance? So if we get back to the example, the cabinet that I show here on the screen was mapped with 25 featherweight open air thermocouples and operated in a controlled 20C ambient environment. Steady state, no door openings, and allowed to fully stabilize. Very happy with its environment and use. So we would think it should be at its top performance. And maybe it is. But is that good enough for vaccines? See all the red squares? Every single point within this cabinet went below the recommended lower range of 2C, and most of them even went below freezing. But look at the average values, all around 3 to 5C. If I had a basic weighted data logger reading once every 30 minutes, I would most likely never or rarely know that my vaccines are constantly being subjected to freezing temperatures, leading to vaccines that have lost partial or complete efficacy. And this is without even opening the door. We can also see here temperatures that are close to 8C, which means as soon as I open that door and warm air goes in and displaces that cold air, I'm most likely going to have pockets within my refrigerator that exceed 8C for a certain period of time. Again, leading to the opposite end of the spectrum problem of vaccines that have been subjected to warm temperatures. So that's now all changing. And that is thanks to a new NSF standard published last year. First, who is the NSF? Not to be confused with the National Science Foundation. Manufacturers, regulators, and consumers look to NSF International for the development of public health standards and certification programs that help protect the world's food, water, consumer products, and environment. Accredited by the American National Standards Institute, or ANSI, NSF has developed over 80 currently active voluntary American national standards under the scope of public health, safety, environment, and sustainability assessment. NSF ANSI standards are developed through a public process that ensures balanced input from industry representatives, public health regulatory officials, and user consumer representatives. The NSF mark is an assurance that the product has been tested by one of the most respected independent certification organizations in existence today. It is valued by consumers, manufacturers, retailers, and regulatory agencies worldwide. So the NSF viewed that there was a gap in standards for vaccines within the US. We just went through what some of those gaps were. And as a result, they put together a multi-institution committee whose goal was to define a set of performance standards for vaccine refrigerators and freezers to help providers select the best products to minimize vaccine wastage. The committee, called the NSF Joint Committee on Vaccine Storage, includes representatives from the CDC, NIST, state health department immunization programs, nonprofit organizations, and vaccine storage equipment manufacturers, including representatives from Thermo Fisher Scientific. This council of about 20 individuals has been working on the standard, which has gone through repeated public comment rounds since 2015. And even now that the standard is launched, that committee will continue for foreseeable future to meet on this standard to see if any additional recommendations or changes are needed to conform to make the standard better or to conform to new trends in the market related to vaccines. Based on an analysis of data from real life usage within clinics, pharmacies, and vaccination sites, the committee created a new standard, NSF456 vaccine storage. To the point, it is a standard, not a regulation, not a requirement. But many domestic and global regulatory bodies, accreditation entities, organizations, public health departments look to standards like these to create their own mandatory or recommended guidelines, all to do their best to mitigate against risk. So while your organization might not have this as a standard requirement today, that's generally because it's so early in the release of the standard. As manufacturers, cold storage manufacturers, certify their products and more are available on the market and it's easier to procure and have the choices that your organization needs, you will start seeing those recommendations start becoming more of requirements from organization to organization or accreditation body to accreditation body. Now, the standard itself covers a lot of missing pieces to properly establish a proper cold storage unit for vaccines. Now, let's dive into the actual standard. Its overall goal is that it will help vaccine administrators choose a storage unit that has been certified to stay within proper temperature to ensure the safety and efficacy of the vaccines and ultimately the public. Or more simply, plainly, the standard is intended to define the appropriate criteria for storage units used to store vaccines. Elements include an audit checklist and criteria for grading that apply to manufacturers of storage units, and the standard includes critical elements of quality management system for proper vaccine storage. The standard is broken down into two temperature ranges, refrigerated, 2 to 8 C, and freezers, -15 to -50. Both look at the same aspects, but for two different temperature ranges. Now, you might ask, at the beginning of this, we saw that some of these COVID vaccines, Pfizer in particular, require ultra-low storage temperature, -70 Celsius or so. And this was a new part of the cold chain within the last year, where the council has been working on this standard for years. It is also a temperature that may continue to evolve warmer, and it hasn't yet, and all indications in the short term is that it won't. But for these reasons and others, the council did not expand the scope to include the ultra-low range. There was a view with everything going on in the world that these standards needed to come out to protect that -2 or +2 to -8 range and -15 to -50 range. The grouping within the standard, within my general terms, fall into three buckets: design, thermal performance, and documentation. Grouping one around is design. Not all units are designed from a form, fit, and function standpoint to store vaccines. So the standard looks at things simply like doors, lids, and closures. Do they fit well and do they self-close? Not all units that are sold today as vaccine storage units really have self-close features or basic door and lid closures that you would expect. Barriers is another big part of the standard. Do the units prevent users from putting vaccines in places that don't meet the temperature performance requirements. We're going to go into this one in a little bit more detail in a few slides here. Um, and then temperature controls. Things like, is it being automatic? Can it be adjusted? Can I actually set the temperature and adjust the temperature? Temperature display and alarms. This is a long one, but some basic pieces are that they are immediate audible visual alarms if the unit goes outside of the prescribed range, and alarms cannot be silenced longer than 15 minutes for refrigerators and 30 minutes for freezers. Now, why might that be important? Is if somebody in the facility accidentally, or not accidentally, hits the snooze button for the alarm, that they don't forget, or the appropriate parties don't miss that alarm has occurred, so they can take the corrective actions that are needed. And then temperature monitoring. Are there accommodations for independent monitoring using a third-party device? Most healthcare facilities, most labs use independent monitoring systems that use independent probes. Well, a lot of those facilities also route those probes through the door gasket. That creates an access for air to exit and enter the cabinet, warm air to displace cold air, and will impact the overall performance within inside the cabinet. So, does the device itself, the refrigerator or freezer, have access ports so you don't have to do that and create that potential risk for ice to build up or an air egress to be created to impact performance? The next grouping is around thermal performance. Units are tested under a very specific test procedure and conditions. For example, they're about in a space that's 22°C plus or minus a degree and a half within a specific humidity range, 20 to 60 RH, and using measurement accuracy of test equipment being, plus or minus 0.5%, as well as many others. And they utilize specifically weighted thermocouples that mirror the weighting of a vaccine vial. So, as I mentioned before, the CDC and others didn't have a recommendation for how those probes were being weighted for those digital data loggers. Well, now we're doing a representation of what the temperature is in the cabinet using weighting of a probe that mirrors what a vaccine vial would actually encounter. And these probes are placed strategically throughout the entire defined usable space. That usable space is determined using a specific criteria. And then the tests are repeated for a loaded and unloaded cabinet to show how that impacts performance. A lot of manufacturers and facilities do predominantly only unloaded cabinets, and they're surprised when they're doing their thermal performance studies. And a lot of people are surprised to see how much that changes once they put actual product into the cabinet. That's for a couple reasons. One, the product creates a thermal mass, stabilizing the internal temperature to a degree. But more importantly, from a negative side, they could block airflow within the cabinet, potentially creating colder or warmer spots within it. So it's important, as this standard shows, to do temperature mapping on a loaded cabinet as well. And there are essentially three tests performed per temperature range. There's a closed door test, which is simply, do all points stay at all times within the allowed range during the test. You cannot exceed that temperature 2 to 8 or -15 to -50 during that closed door test. However, with one caveat, there is accommodation for auto defrost functionality, which allows 15 minutes to recover time back to the upper bound of the acceptable temperature range, or 15 minutes to get back to 8°C, or 15 minutes to get back to -15°C. Then there's a short door opening test. This is a 3-hour test of openings occurring every 10 minutes. So high use situation that it's mirroring, and those doors are open 2 seconds to open the door, 4 seconds for it to be open and 2 seconds to close it. And that short door test, that first part, is followed by a secondary short door test that's an hour long, doing that same 8 second door opening, but it's every 5 minutes. So it's mirroring somebody going in and out and retrieving a dose every 5 minutes. High use situation. And during this test, the cabinet needs to stay within the bounds as well. So not only when the door is closed, but also when the door is being opened repeatedly, the unit has to stay within those bounds. Now, if we think back to that commercial grade unit, even when the door was closed and not opened, the unit didn't stay within the bounds. So you can imagine once the door was opened, like in this test, it would have no shot of being able to stay within those bounds, nearly anywhere near within those bounds. And then the third test is a long door opening test. This test happens after 15 minutes or so after the last short door test to let the unit recover, and it lasts for 3 minutes. So that big door or small door or whatever size it is opened and left open for 3 minutes. Try to sit and just stare at a clock for 3 minutes. That is a long time when you're retrieving or loading product. So it's looking at the extreme use case again. Then all points in the cabinet have to recover back below 8C or below negative 15C within 15 minutes. So it doesn't give them a very long window to get all the way back. But it does allow the cabinet to get warmer than those bounds for that 3 minute period. The two door opening tests were designed to mimic typical use within a clinic. It was found that during routine use, door openings are approximately 8 seconds long, but they have a very high frequency. This is typical dosage retrieval. The longer test mimics the bulk loading of product into the cabinets, which happens much less frequently, but the duration is much longer. Now, I mentioned earlier that the test accommodates for auto defrost. There are some that shy away from auto defrost functionality because they perceive that the defrost process can greatly impact product temperature in the cabinet. But like I said earlier about refrigerators, not all defrost freezers are created equal. What we see in this test method and historically gathered data, door openings have a far greater impact on cabinet and product temperature than the defrost cycle of high performance units designed for the storage of vaccines. This standard helps to highlight and reinforce that point. Not to go into the nitty gritty of how an auto defrost freezer works, but the whole cabinet isn't defrosting. All your product isn't being warmed to, positive temperatures to remove that ice. It's only the refrigeration system, the evaporator deck, that is allowed to warm itself, and where cabinet temperature doesn't change dramatically, and product temperature itself really only changes a few degrees at most. So the last section here is documentation. And you would be surprised what might and might not come with a refrigerator and freezer. So what this standard looked at is the big one, the manual, and updating it to show where third-party probes could be routed, how often calibration should be done, and other things around proper use of the unit and what it is intended for. Labeling. The standard now requires usable space to be indicated, and where third-party test label certification be present on the unit itself, i.e. saying this unit has actually been certified for this standard. And then calibration certificates shall be provided with units and be kept on record with suppliers. Not all refrigerators and freezers are calibrated at the manufacturing sites before leaving. And I would say, even though all of these units are now calibrated to meet this standard, or units that do meet the standard or certified to it are calibrated, I would still recommend doing your own calibration when units arrive, because things could change during shipment, or units could be sat in storage for a period of time, or you might have a different calibration standard than what is used by the manufacturer, i.e., you cannot calibrate to center point mass or to where your alarm probe is or something else. So I still, even though these are now coming calibrated, you should still do your own calibration. Now, there's far more detail to what the standard looks at than I have time, but there are two sections I want to review a little bit more in detail, and that's performance and barriers. So first off, performance. On these graphs, you can see what the results of a test protocol look like for both a refrigerator and freezer, both unloaded and loaded. The test starts off in steady state with the doors closed, goes to the short door test in 2 phases, and then the long door test. You can see on a unit properly designed and certified to the standard that the temperature stays well within the 2 to 8 limits for refrigerators, as well that the door openings do have an impact, but they're not large. And when the cabinet is loaded, it stays even tighter between those lines. Thermal mass buffer is essentially what the CDC was attempting to achieve with their recommendations by having water bottles placed around the walls and storing product in the middle. And that's how loose the standard was for this, or the recommendation was for from the CDC. If you look through that toolkit, they'll actually, if you're using a standard home goods refrigerator, they'll tell you to fill the walls or line the walls with water bottles to replicate a unit that should be designed for this purpose. Now, for the freezers, you can see that in addition to door openings, there was also an auto defrost event. Even with that process in the middle of the door openings, the unit stayed below -15 limit. Again, a sign of a purpose-built unit. In each section of those 4 total tests, you can see the impact the user and conditions have on the unit to maintain temperature. From some being minimal impact, first phase of the door openings, especially when loaded, to major impacts like the 3-minute door opening, that large spike there at the end. But you can see for the freezers, in a loaded freezer, that 3-minute door opening at no point in the cabinet doesn't even exceed the -15 limit. A properly designed unit. Now, there will be other products that are certified to the NSF standard or broad array that might have wider performance but still meet the standard. Let's say in the first short door opening section, that they might just get to just below 8C, or they might just get just above 2C. Now, what does that mean? They meet the standard and they pass the standard, but any additional stress or reduction in performance over time increases that risk that you might exceed those boundaries. So finding a unit that not only meets the design intent and is certified to the standard is important, but finding one that has larger barriers, thermal barriers, performance barriers away from those limits is going to reduce your risk even more over time. So the next part, why barriers? Why did the standard recommend barriers be placed into the units? And what does barriers mean? In a refrigerator and freezer, not all points in the cabinet are the same temperature, and all points fluctuate to a degree. In order to make sure vaccines aren't put in places within the cabinet that exceed the limits in the standards mandates, that area be blocked. Block could be in the form of a physical barrier, a defined barrier, and in combination an indicated area. This could be as simple as having borders on your baskets or shelves that prevent product from touching the walls, or as prohibitive as a cage or something blocking that entire area. If we look at this for the freezer example, now again, this is a commercial grade freezer, not specifically designed for vaccine storage. We can see some stay above the -15 limit, but others don't. This is done with outdoor openings, so we know this unit will probably struggle to maintain above -15 in other places. But for this example, let's pretend it ran the whole test and got this performance. In this case, to pass the standard, the top shelf would probably need to be blocked off completely to ensure vaccines weren't stored there. So the manufacturer would design some method to prevent that. That's going to be an immediate indication that this unit was not designed for the storage of vaccines. When you go out on the market to choose a freezer, it'll be important to understand how much actual space is left for you to use. Traditionally, manufacturers would just use the entire volume of the inner cabinet as their capacity. Well, that's now the standard has them actually defined, well, where can product actually be placed to give you a much better understanding of how much storage capacity you really do have. For this unit, if certified as a customer, I would know that the space has been limited, but would also want to look at the data to make sure, knowing my own usage type, let's say I'm a high usage and I'm in a warm ambient conditions, that this unit is borderline at -15 at every point. So if I'm a heavy usage facility, my door openings would probably kick me past these limits pretty frequently, meaning I should probably move on and pick a different unit that will stay well above that warm alarm limit. The same is true for refrigerators as well. All of these points and recommendations could easily be transferred to other applications in the lab or healthcare space. So, a few further considerations and best practices to look at, because the standard only covers a certain amount of things. It doesn't cover how users actually use it and how they should maintain their product. So, how you use your equipment can greatly impact their performance. They're made to handle everyday life, or ours are. For real world situations, however, you still want to be prescriptive with door openings. Minimize them, minimize the frequency, have a system of inventory management so you know where things are. Pay attention to what the unit is telling you. A lot of units have indicators for something that may be going wrong outside of just temperature performance, or maybe it's running a little harder than, or a little bit louder. Make sure you're listening to what the unit is telling you. Make use of any of those onboard capabilities as well, and consolidate your cargo. Each vial is its neighbor's best friend from a thermodynamic perspective. And then a little TLC goes a long way. Um, Follow the recommendations in the user manual. Clean the filters, remove excess frost or ice if it starts to accumulate. Consider warranty upgrades or service plans to maximize uptime. And then always have contact information handy for your service provider when and if something does go wrong. And then lastly, from a recommendation standpoint, I recommend, a lot of people recommend, organizations require it, but it's always something good to look at for having remote monitoring systems as part of your risk mitigation strategy. It's going to help with sample safety and security. It's going to make your workflows more efficient, and it's going to help with asset management and cost savings in the long run. It's going to reduce risk and gain operational efficiency. Now, we've gone through a lot in this 40 minutes or so. The new era of vaccines, wastage, what the CDC recommends, what the new vaccine storage requirement or recommendations are from and standards are from the NSF, some little TLC guidelines and recommendations. But let's go and look at what some of the solutions are out there now that meet this standard and how they improve protection. So Thermo Scientific has the TSX line, which is purpose built for critical storage. Luckily at Thermo Fisher, we've kept the protection of vaccines in mind while we innovate. We've been, for many, many years, been selling into the clinical and healthcare space for the purposes of vaccines. A lot of people remember the old Jewett brand. And that is why the Thermo TSX series of high performance refrigerators and freezers are purpose built to store critical products like vaccines that are sensitive to temperature variations. This series is intended to meet the standards, and over 35 models and configurations are currently certified to it. We look closely at the temperature performance in all parts of the usable space in the cabinets when we design this line. We go beyond actually what the standard recommends for performance. And while some manufacturers publish performance data, the methodology used to generate the data are often inconsistent, which could lead to an improper understanding of a product's capabilities. That is why it is crucial to understand the meaning and test methodology behind thermal performance data, including that of the TSX refrigerators and freezers. You should ask any of your representatives from any of your manufacturers for more detailed testing and performance data. The TSX series, while it's one part of our portfolio, we're going to continue to look at expanding that. And while this is our flagship line that delivers low energy, it's Energy Star certified, has the ACT label for sustainability, is very quiet, best performance, and has a long reliability covered by a 10-year warranty, there are other products within the portfolio that we are looking to move towards this standard as well. And you will see from other manufacturers that more and more product being brought to the market. But there are many products available today that are called vaccine storage that do not meet the standard set by NSF. For this reason, again, it's important to have these discussions with your cold storage providers now to understand their plans in supporting your ongoing need to properly protect the vaccines you store. And then the last point that I want to cover before we wrap here is you should also consider a size to fit your need. Not all spaces need the same size unit, and not all units of the same series or the same manufacturer will perform the same depending on how you load them. So it's important to find units that meet your use case. So if you're an endpoint storage and you only go through, a couple dozen vaccine dosage a day, you don't need what your distribution hub is using, that they're processing thousands of vaccines a day, sending those out to the various pharmacies, healthcare facilities, or so forth. And why this is also important and to understand is finding a unit that will not only meet your capacity needs today, but also meet those that are needed for when there are fluxes in demand. There's a next round of boosters, or it's flu season, or whatever it may be. You can accommodate that without overfilling your unit. Because as I mentioned earlier, if you overfill a unit and block that airflow more, you're going to impact the performance within that unit, potentially creating warm or cold spots. Conversely, if you have a unit that's just running empty all the time because you've gotten a unit that's way too big, one, you're wasting space in your facility. Two, you probably wasted a little bit of capital budget. And three, your unit's going to perform wider because it doesn't have that thermal mass by volume ratio to keep the cabinet more stable. So just make sure to select the product that most closely aligns to your volume needs. And with that, um, I want to say thank you, and I'll pass it back. And I believe we'll go through some Q&A.
Thank you, Chase, for your informative presentation. We will now start the live Q&A portion of the webinar. If you have a question you'd like to ask, please do so now. Just click on the Ask a Question box located on the bottom right of your screen. We'll answer as many of your questions as we have time for. Let's get started. Our first question is, are ultra cold temperatures like negative 70 Celsius covered in the standard?
Thanks. And like I mentioned, no, not today, and not from the initial release of the standard, because of the need and desire to get this standard on the market to have the most benefit it could during these trying times. However, as I also mentioned, these standards continue to evolve, and over time, there may be standards, a revision of this standard that would look at that and look at those temperatures.
All right. Next question. Is this a mandate or requirement? What if I don't use an NSF456 unit in my facility?
Right. So today, it's not a mandate or requirement from a federal or most state levels. They're not going to, the CDC has not come out and said that thou must use NSF456 units for the storage of vaccines. However, the CDC was a member of this body, of this council, and helped develop these recommendations. So could it be one day? Maybe, potentially. Could it be one day for the participation in programs like Vaccines for Children? Potentially. But more realistically, the short-term requirements are actually going to come from organizations themselves that are looking to reduce risk. And what do I mean by reduce risk? If you have a batch of vaccines that exceeds the point that you have to discard because of improper storage, and you see that you are using a non-NSF456 or non-vaccine designed unit, it opens the door from a risk standpoint of fingers being pointed of not being using the proper unit for that application, whether that be from an insurance standpoint, litigation standpoint, or whatever it may be. So you will see people start adopting these standards to reduce that risk as much as possible.
All right, thank you. Next question. If I have an older version of something that is now certified to the standard, does that mean my older one meets the standard?
Unfortunately, no. So most likely, most manufacturers have changed minor things to meet the standard. Not all did. We didn't have to for most, or actually any of our products. However, certification is only for once units are audited. The factory has been audited, the manufacturing process, the documentation, the performance has been tested. So it's only newly manufactured units that, quote unquote, are certified to that. Now, as I mentioned, this is not a regulation or requirement saying you have to go out and use NSF only products. So if you are using models that are of the older version that now do meet the standard, that at least gives you the comfort in knowing that the units that you're using today should meet it from a performance standpoint, and that those should not be on your short list for units that you should be replacing if you're wanting to reduce your risk or use units that are purpose built for the storage of vaccines.
All right, thank you. It looks like we have time for one more question. Why do some vaccine manufacturers recommend not using frost-free freezers?
Yeah, this was an interesting one. Early on in the rollout, backing up a little bit, there's things called manual and auto defrost freezers. They're kind of, to a large degree, self-explanatory. Manual defrost freezers, you have to manually defrost. They have ice build up on the wall or shelves over time, and you have to unplug them and defrost them. Auto defrost freezers, in contrast, you don't have to do that. The ice removal is mitigated through the refrigeration system routinely by itself. Now, why is that? Why do some vaccine manufacturers today, not historically, but today, have fear of frost free? And it's for the very reason that the standard, one of the very reasons the standard was created, because people, frost free or auto defrost is a broad term that can be applied to home good units, commercial grade units, and scientific and medical grade units. Where a home good unit, that auto defrost process, like your home unit, could swing you into very wide temperature ranges, potentially above zero. And that's why you see it in your home refrigerator freezer combo unit. You might get ice buildup on your ice cream or produce or whatever that you have in your freezer. Well, that's the process of a product going through extreme temperature where the moisture is being pulled out of the product, evaporating, and then refreezing on the surface. Well, in a purpose-built auto defrost unit, you're not going to see that. But to be as safe as possible, so because the standard didn't exist, those manufacturers shied away from using auto defrost freezers in fear that people might use home good or commercial grade auto defrost freezers. But traditionally, vaccine freezers have been auto defrost, or those purpose built for the storage of vaccines. And they have a huge benefit of auto defrost freezers have much better door open recovery time and uniformity overall.
Thank you, Chase. Do you have any final comments for our audience?
I just this. I would say thank you again for taking the time to get on this. I know it's again a very busy, chaotic time. If you do have any questions offline that you want to send, I am happy to talk more on this topic or any other healthcare scientific cold storage topics. But yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you again, Chase, for your time today and your important research. We would also like to thank LabRoots and our sponsor, Thermo Fisher Scientific, for underwriting today's educational webcast. Before we go, I'd like to thank the audience for joining us today and for their interesting questions. Questions we did not have time for today, and those submitted during the on demand period, will be addressed by the speaker via the contact information you provided at the time of registration. This webcast can be viewed on demand. LabRoots will alert you via email when it's available for replay. We encourage you to share that email with your colleagues who may have missed today's live event. Until next time, goodbye.